Welcome back, AP. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it so you don't lose too much time this evening. And also, we are hauling right now. I'm telling you right now, we may be seeing your next test at the beginning of next week rather than the end, right? Because we right now are getting very, very close to approaching that kind of critical threshold where the French Revolution starts to just move very quickly, right? Because we literally, when you've been looking at it, have been spending a lot of time in the moments leading up to the revolution, and then from 1789 up until what we're now in 1792, right? And if you really look at the events of everything, the Estates General started in May of 1789, and then we are now sitting in August of 1792, when the Tuileries Palace is going to be stormed by a contingent of Revolutionary Army soldiers, and they are going to be tried to held back by a group of the King's Royal Guard, right? Now, all this entire time, we know that the king tried to flee, and it didn't work out. The Declaration of Independence is getting crazy. We got revolution in the colonies. We got women's rights increasing, but we also have women's rights activists being later executed. We have the liberals are like showing up. We now also are in a France that is in all-out war, right? And not only that, but you're seeing just a changing of the guard, right? You're seeing a change of everything. You're even going to see huge new events that I'm going to talk about tomorrow where, like, the French flag is going to be changed, and they're going to adopt a new national anthem, and, like, everything's getting wild. And do me a favor really quick. As of 1792, write down, as of 1792 really quick, we're seeing a new flag and a new national anthem. And remind me, and I will play the national anthem at the beginning of class tomorrow, okay, for your warm-up song. And it is absolutely fantastic. It's got some intense lines in it, like, and the fields of our, like, and our fields will be watered with the blood of our enemies, and rah, right? But to pick up where we left off in class, we were talking about the Tuileries Palace being stormed by a group of French revolutionary leaders, right? And a lot of this boils down to the fact that they were angry and frustrated with the fact that the king tried to flee. And a year since that happened, about a year since that happened, they were also frustrated with the fact that things were not progressing forward. They were now in war. They were now actually trying to basically eat it, or like fight. Like, they were basically going to war to eat, right? They were trying to find out ways to take supplies and grains and other goods from other outside countries, while also they're starting to get really intimidated by these other countries trying to threaten them, and these coalition armies rising up, right? So what ends up breaking out is when a large group of revolutionary soldiers and also revolutionary citizens, which we'll talk about those guys here in a second, they show up outside the Tuileries, and shots begin to get fired, right? And the shots begin to fire off, and this is in August of 1792, and what ends up happening is the revolutionary crowd runs in, storms into the Tuileries, rips Louis out of his chambers, and then they bring him outside to be brought in front of the new Revolutionary Council, right? The Legislative Assembly is what it's called at this point. They bring him outside, and what do they do to him? Some of you are probably thinking, oh, they probably beat him up, or oh, they probably, like, striped his legs, is what my grandma used to say all the time. Louis storming of Tuileries. Now, here we go. So what ends up occurring, though, is actually kind of funny. They forced Louis to wear something. And when they came out and they brought him outside, they forced him to wear the red cap of the revolution. Here is Louis right here when they had stormed and brought him outside, and they put on top of him one of the red caps of the revolutions that had a tricolor cockade pinned on it, right? Because these people never forgot the story that Jean-Paul Marat actually wrote, saying that he stomped on a cockade, which led to the Women's March, right? They're never going to forget the fact that they wear this hat around and is a symbol of their revolution. And so what do you think has happened at this point? How much power does Louis really have left? None at all, right? It's now pretty much over. And so to try and figure out what they're going to do with the government without having a king, because they basically now are dead set on the fact that we will not have a king anymore, right? They're deciding to become what is known as a republic, right? And so the Legislative Assembly that was formerly the National Assembly, so you have to understand, it goes through several different names. It was the National Assembly, and then it was and then it becomes the Legislative Assembly. And now it's going to take on a new form, right? They save the royals from being murdered in the streets. The Legislative Assembly decides we are going to put them on trial. We are going to hold them accountable for their crimes. We are going to accuse them of the wrongs that they have done, but let's not murder them in the streets, all right? So, but this is the thing, though, is this Legislative Assembly was failing to govern effectively. So they felt they needed to bring on a new one. So now you're seeing the rise of this thing known as the National Convention, right? And the National Convention is going to do away with any legislative assembly that has existed before, and it's going to be elected by universal male suffrage, something that Maximilian Robespierre has been advocating for since the start of the revolution, right? Universal male suffrage is when every man, regardless of property rights, is allowed to vote. Now, this is important because this is 1792 that this occurs, and that means that in 1792, men in France now had more voting rights than men in America, because of 1792 in America, they weren't even formally done, like they did, only men that could vote were men that could read and had property, right? So like if you owned property and could read, you were allowed to vote, right? But this convention is going to be elected by universal male suffrage, so this is a major moment. And what's going to happen is you're going to end up with 749 delegates at this thing known as the National Convention, right? And of these 749 delegates, 26% of them were Jacobins, right? And the Montagnards were still in this group. They were sitting over here on that high level seats. And then you had 21% of them were Girondins, right? So this is a little bit scary. 51% of the vote was the Plain, right? So, but why is this terrifying? How are the numbers of 26 and 21 indicative of the way that the revolution is going? How is it indicative of the idea of the acceptance of violence? How is the difference of numbers of 26 and 21 really important in understanding the radical phase is on its way? Because at no point before this did the Jacobins have an overwhelming majority over top of the Girondins. Some of y'all are probably saying to yourself, that's not that big of a number, Mr. Terry. But look, out of almost 800 delegates, 5% more of the voting body is literally like 40 more representatives? Like, that's a huge number more when you're talking about passing votes or passing laws or trying to convince this 51% of the Plain to vote in your favor. And also, this 51% is becoming much more heavily in favor of aggressive acts, violent acts, and things like that, because it's what the people want, right? Now, speaking of the people, things are getting crazy, okay? And the poor, and I don't care if your parents are reading this right now, I don't care, I'm sorry, I just don't, but the poor are pissed. They're so upset because they feel that things are not moving fast enough. Something you got to understand about the poor members of society in the French Revolution by this point, they have now endured 3 years of revolution, right? We're talking they are the ones that are being recruited for the army, right? This new French First Republican Army that is going to be drafted up to go fight the War of the Second Coalition, because they actually pretty efficiently win the War of the First Coalition, they are going to be the ones drafted into it, right? The poor are the ones fighting these wars, right? Standing up for the revolution that they believe was going to give them property and rights. And it was, right? And like a lot of people like a Robespierre or a Marat or a Danton would advocate for the fact that the sans-culottes did have more now than they ever had in the past. And they're not wrong, but the sans-culottes still have some problems, right? And why are they so mad? Sorry, y'all don't even know who the sans-culottes are yet. You don't even know. You don't even know. Let's go ahead and discuss them, right? So when we're discussing the people of the revolution, you got to understand that we were heavily divided as groups going into the revolution, right? The Ancien regime had rural peasants, urban workers, bourgeois, road nobles, sword nobles, and the Catholic clergy, not including the rulers of the entirety of France, including the royals and extended family and the nobles that were related to them. But you also had to understand that the ruling group, or the organizational group of the French revolutionary persons involved in Paris, were mostly these guys. That, my friends, is a bourgeois member. That right there is what you would imagine a bourgeois to look like. The Marquis de Lafayette, he was a member of this class, right? The Maximilian Robespierre was a bourgeois as well, right? Was a member of this middle class, right? They were wealthy. They had money. They were educated. And at the beginning of the revolution, you want those people to be in charge because they understand how laws are written. They understand tax code. They understand the financial situation. They understand steps that could be done to give more power and rights back to the people of France, right? But now, as the revolution is progressing forward, you're seeing this group of people gain a lot more power, a lot more influence, and they are basically becoming the militia. Write this down, the militia of the revolution. Ooh, I got a little chill in my back. How come I've never actually said this before? This group is now referred to as the sans-culottes, right? So this sans-culottes, that is them right there, okay? Sans-culottes members are basically as follows. They are poor, working class, violent members that support the revolution, right? When the Tuileries was stormed, it was sans-culottes members who did it. When you could consider the women that marched on Versailles sans-culottes members, right? And the sans-culottes is a word that had been around for a while, right? Ever since the start of the revolution, they were sometimes referred to as sans-culottes in a derogatory sense, right? It was an insult. People that looked like this, the bourgeois members, insulted these poor members of the revolutions by calling them sans-culottes. And what do we do with negative monikers? We take them on a lot of times, and they are used to define us as a people. You take something negative, you spin it into positive. Just like what happened in the English Civil War. The Roundheads were insulted by the Cavaliers, and the Cavaliers were called that because it was an insult from the Roundheads, right? So the sans-culottes, what it means without trousers, right? So very, very important thing to understand, that it basically means no pants. But as you can see, they did have pants. They weren't running around bottomless trying to fight this revolution, which would be terrifying. What it meant was sans means without, and culottes are these very, 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 very wealthy people wore them. They're silk knee breeches, right? They're these things that you would put on. See, this man is not wearing shorts. He actually has pants on, and they are form-fitting, very tight, and they go all the way up your leg, and that's when you then slip your feet into shoes. It's made to look kind of like pantyhose almost, right? Well, the poor members, the sans-culottes, didn't have the money to afford things like that, so they were basically called without, because what they wore is they wore what's known as pantaloons or trousers, right? They wore loose-fitting working man's pants, right? So that is what the sans-culottes have become called, and they're now beginning to call themselves that, right? And the sans-culottes are realizing that we want, jot this down, simple solutions, right? Sans-culottes members are becoming increasingly violent because they want to be fed more, they want to have more money, and they want quick solutions to everything. They're tired of a revolution continuing to roll forward at a slow pace. They're sick of the liberal phase. They want a radical phase, right? And look how close we are. As of 1793, the radical phase begins. Marie Rowley, just a heads up, because I know you like to make sure you know what phase we're in. By 1793, it begins, right? It begins. And we are in August of 1792, and we just stormed the Tuileries Palace, right? And he is going to have his rights stripped and all this other stuff. But because of the wars going on, you're going to see big events like the September massacres break out, all right? So just to give you a heads up of what the September massacres are, that is a good example of an event when the sans-culottes kind of took charge of the revolution on their own, grabbed it, and really ran with it, right? Now, the sans-culottes, what they're going to do is, because remember, kind of just remember back in the back of your mind, right, when we were talking about today, we're splitting up Poland and we're going crazy in Europe, and then also we're at war, right? They are at war. French Revolutionary Wars are going to span from 1792 up until 1806, technically up until 1815, if you really consider then the French Wars of Revolution, including the double exile of Napoleon, which I do, right? So, some historians would argue that they ended in 1806. I disagree, all right? So now, but I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that since France is at war, who are the people fighting in this war? The sans-culottes members are the ones fighting in this war. The ones who were unable to go off and leave their families that stayed behind, they were frustrated and upset because they knew that the French men were out fighting this war. And they feared, listen closely, they feared that the other armies, the Austrians, the Prussians, were going to breach their borders and get into Paris and try to stop the revolution. And the poor people, they have simple solutions in their minds. And they're thinking in their mind, well, if the Prussians and the Austrians got here, by the time they got here, they would have lost a lot of their forces. A lot of their men would have died. They would have needed reinforcements. And where would they find reinforcements against the revolution in this period in time? They'd find them in the prisons, right? So the enemies of the revolution this whole time had been locked up in the prisons. Some of those enemies include people like the non-swearing priests, the refractory priests, right? Include other members of the bourgeois that were against the revolution early on, other members of the nobility and things like that. So on the September Massacre Day, what happened is the sans-culottes went to every single prison in Paris, pulled all the prisoners out, and then executed them in the streets. All right, so somewhere in the neighborhood of several hundred people were killed in the matter of a couple of days, right? Let's look this up really quick. September massacres, casualties. Casualties. There we go. All right, so it looks like we've got, it is estimated that around 1,100 to 1,600 people were murdered in the streets, right, by the Sans-Culottes members by having them decapitated with a sword, and apparently some documents have, seen, apparently, the claim that some people were being beaten to death with hammers, all right? So, it is a very extreme time. France is winning their wars. Yes, that is a good thing, even though you're murdering people in the streets back at home. And they're going to officially, as of September of 1792, be declared a republic, okay? And they're going to be known as the French First Republic, right? So this is where we start getting into all this wishy-washy stuff, right? We're going to be called the French First Republic, then we're going to be called the French First Empire, then we're going to be called the French Second Republic, then we're going to be called the French Second Empire, then we're going to be the French Third Republic, blah, 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 blah. Now, look, declared a republic, though, and in a republican system, there is one thing you do not need. And the Venetians had figured this out a long time ago during the Renaissance, and then the Romans had figured this out a long time ago, as early as 700 BC, right, when Romulus and Remus decide that no kings will ever exist inside of Rome, right? What do you not need, Romulus and Remus? If you're a republic, you need no king, right? So Louis is literally going to be stripped of all title, and he is going to be put on trial for treason against the French people. So as of late 1792, Louis is no longer the king of France, right? And he has had all of his titles stripped. He is literally now just some noble guy that exists there. Now, he's going to be put on trial for treason, and the National Convention is going to deem him guilty, right? Now we've got two options. We have a man guilty of treason. So there's going to be a vote that comes down. You're going to have to decide now, National Convention, are we going to execute him or are we going to exile him? Well, they took it to a vote, and remember back at the 749 members of the National Convention right here, now that means that the Girondinists and the Jacobins have a job. They have to try and convince this 51% to do one or the other. The Jacobins want him executed. The Girondins want him exiled, right? The Girondins lose, and he is executed in 1793, right? He is also executed in a square that was built by his grandfather, right? Louis XV statue was looking down at him the day that he was executed, right? The day he was executed, apparently it was a beautiful day in France, but not so beautiful for Louis. And he stood upon the scaffold and said, I am not guilty of these crimes of which I have been accused, right? The only thing I am guilty of is supporting the people of France. And he is then summarily executed. And he is one of the very first people to be executed using this device, all right? So he is executed using this, the guillotine, right? So this guillotine, this device that executed Louis is a very, very important thing, okay? Let me double check something real fast. So Louis was not the first person to be executed by the guillotine, but he was one of the earliest, right? So as of April 1792, one man had been executed using the guillotine so far, and he was a highway worker in France, just a regular kind of guy that apparently lashed out against the revolution, claimed that it was doing negative things, and he's going to be executed by the guillotine, right? And now Louis, though, is going to be executed as of January 30th, I think it's January 30th or 31st, of 1793, all right? Now, when he is executed, he is going to be the very, very first person that leads a parade of people to the guillotine. Once this happens, the radical phase begins, okay? The radical phase begins with the death of Louis XVI, right, in 1793. The guillotines were then erected in all French cities, right? And then they're going to be used excessively. They're all going to be painted red so that they can be used to hide the blood stains from the executions. They have a little lifting seat so they can actually lift you up and slide the body off, and it drops down below the scaffold, and they can continue to execute as many people as possible. Now, we'll talk about why the guillotine was used a little bit later on. We'll talk about it in class, right? Big thing we'll talk about in class. We'll talk about it because it's more egalitarian and all this other stuff. But Louis is going to be executed, which begins the radical phase, right? So in your notes, you say radical phase, right? The Girondinists are then, since they did not want to see the death of Louis, are going to be deposed by the Sans-Culottes. The Jacobins go up to the Sans-Culottes members and have them go out, arrest, and bring in for trials against France and for trials of treason as well. And the Girondinists are wiped out by the Jacobins, and all of them are executed via the guillotine. And this is the terrifying thing. The Jacobins are now in control of France. Their enemy, the Girondinists, are now gone. And so, formed by your man, Maximilien Robespierre, is a new group of the government known as the Committee of Public Safety. And the Committee of Public Safety was a de facto monarchy. Jot that down. De facto monarchy. Now, the Committee of Public Safety, just to give you a really quick heads up on when it was founded, it was apparently founded in April 6th of 1793, following the purge of the Girondinists, right? I knew it was 1793. It was like a couple months after Louis was dead. And the Committee of Public Safety, now that these Girondins are gone, they become this new de facto monarchy. So basically, in a nutshell, the Mountain, the Marat, Danton, and Robespierre are now ruling over France, right? And the counter-revolutionaries are beginning to revolt, right? To sit here and say that everybody wanted the revolution is stupid, right? Like, so there were people out there that were like, this is getting out of hand. You're just starting to execute people left and right. You're doing whatever you want, da-da-da-da-da. And since the counter-revolutionaries are revolting, the Committee of Public Safety is going to decide to do what? Arrest them, try them for treason, and use this new bad boy as much as possible. Basically, what ends up happening is you're now entering into a time period known as the Reign of Terror, right? Where literally fear is going to be used to try and quell and prevent the anti-revolutionary or counter-revolutionary people from rioting against the revolution. And how do you do that? The Committee of Public Safety starts to change as much things as possible to keep the Sans-Culottes members happy, okay? The Committee of Public Safety, I will basically say the cops, and I refer to the Sans-Culottes as just the Sans, right? So they want to do as much as possible to keep them happy. They need the Sans on their side. The Committee of Public Safety is using the Sans-Culottes as their little militia, right? So they start changing a lot of things in France to try and keep the Sans-Culottes members happy, to keep them from revolting against them, and to keep going out there and finding counter-revolutionaries to bring to the guillotine and have them executed, right? And the biggest thing that they do initially is they create a planned economy, right? And what they do is they set prices on certain goods. How do you keep the poor and the violent happy? You keep them fed, right, Carson, right? And they create this thing known as the bread of equality. The bread, literally, pastries, danishes, donuts, cakes, anything that took a lot of money to make was outlawed in France under the Committee of Public Safety. There was no more brioche, Marie Antoinette. There was no more of these things. And basically what happens is the price of bread is set, right? So, and the planned economy was actually a massive backfire, right? It's not going to do well for the economy, but they were only doing this in the first place just to keep the Sans-Culottes members happy, right? The bread of equality was basically a bread made of any wheat they could get their hands on, right? It was a simple kind of rye or like simple wheat bread, all right? Now, also, they're now in a moment of total war, right? So with the planned economy, all industries that used to make anything like textiles or whatever, all their industries are now solely operating for the war effort, right? If you used to make clothes, now you're making uniforms for the army. If you used to be a blacksmith, now you're making guns for the army, right? If you used to be somebody who grew like grain, you're now growing grain to make this bread of equality that we're also shipping to the front line so we can support the army, right? Basically, what you could consider this is like emergency socialism, right? But it's extreme socialism. Not the socialism that people advocate for in democratic systems now, which is like universal health care and, things like that. This is emergency socialism in the sense of basically no one owns private property anymore and everything is going to support the Committee of Public Safety and then also going to support the war effort, right? And this whole era of the planned economy, the total war, the crazy stuff going on in France is known as the Reign of Terror. And just to give you a heads up really quick, let's look up what years the Reign of Terror spanned. And I believe it's from 1793 to 1794. And it is 1793 to 1794. The Reign of Terror is considered to have started in September 5th, 1793, and said to have ended at around July 28th with the Thermidor reaction around 1794, okay? So the biggest thing about it is the series of trials that ruled with dictatorial power were insane. insane, right? What the Committee of Public Safety dedicates themselves and the Sans Culottes to do is to go out and hunt down anyone who might even seem like they're against the revolution, right? It could be your local baker, your candlestick maker, your anything, right? If they've even uttered words about being anti-revolutionary, they would be hunted down as enemies of the revolution, brought in front of these things known as revolutionary tribunals, which were wildly out of control, no jury, no judge, just 2 or 3 judicators sitting up on a bench, and they were massively public. And the Sans Culottes members used to go watch these trials for entertainment and scream for the death of these infidels against the revolution, right? And these trials are going to lead to the executions of some 40,000 people all over France. 40,000. And over 300,000 are going to be arrested. That means that if you're doing the math on this, I don't know if you are, but if you are, that means you had a 1 out of 6 chance of being executed for something as simple as saying, I don't like the way the revolution is going. That's why it's called the Reign of Terror. They believe by executing as many people as possible, by doing this, it will deter any one of these counter-revolutionaries. So rule through fear, right? And this was used to help stop these counter-revolutionaries in the countryside, right? And a lot of other really screwed up stuff is going to happen. A lot of women start kind of propping up and saying, why are you doing this to our husbands? They were actually supportive of the revolution. What are you doing? Also, now that he's dead, I inherit his property and blah, 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 blah. And so the Jacobins are going to suppress women's rights during this period. Olympia de Gaulle, our woman who actually issued the Declarations of the Rights of Women, right, is going to be guillotined as well in this. And also, who is doing this? George Danton, Maximilien Robespierre, and Jean-Paul Marat are sitting on high as the Montagnards, ordering the death left and right of all these people as the Committee of Public Safety, right? Changed how time was kept. The Committee of Public Safety did away with religion. They said that religion is no longer needed. They closed churches, which is crazy. That's de-Christianization. They closed churches. They tried to turn Notre Dame into a shopping mall. They changed how time was kept. They changed the number of days per month. They changed the name of all of the months of the year. July went from being called July to being called Thermidor because it's hot. All right, so it's all this crazy stuff is happening. The Reign of Terror is getting out of hand, right? We're going to stop right there, okay? Because I think y'all need a second to kind of decompress with all that. And also, we've been running. I've been getting a little too excited, all right? So I'll see you guys soon. Y'all have a great evening. Y'all have a good one.